Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. It is indeed showtime. It's on the Ledger Ontario Politics podcast, and we are recording this on Friday, May 23rd. And I know for those of you who are close and careful listeners and viewers of this podcast, you will know that we rarely do this, if ever, on a Friday. We normally record it on a Thursday. But, as Aaron would say, our CEO at SSN, Mercury is in retrograde. And I don't really know what that means, except that when shit goes sideways, she always says that. So yesterday we had some calendar crunches and everything else. And so we decided, let's just make it life simpler for everybody. And we'll move it to Friday. So anyway, we've still got a couple of absences in the room, but we've got folks around the table this week and lots to talk about. Keith Leslie is here. You see and hear him on CH Television, a longtime veteran commentator from Queen's Park. Tim Hudak with us, a partner at Counsel Public Affairs and former leader of the PC Party of Ontario. And, one of those go sideways things happened yesterday, Tim. I know things were all lined up. You were ready to do the show. And then you tell, oh, geez, my daughter just ended up in the city finals track and field, and we got to go and do that. And then you were all ready to go to the meet, and
rain delay.
No.
It's like, we're all packed, ready to head off and, get through the traffic, get down there. And then when the officials got to the track, it was half covered in water, which would be pretty hard. And Maitland's a long jumper, right? So taking the strides, leaping, and fall into the quicksand would probably not have been a good sports moment. Proud of her, though. It's like, thanks for asking, Dave. It's blast watching her, right? She's very, very driven. She's played basketball in a league with all boys to date, which has made her, much more skilled, aggressive, and driven. Love it when she knocks them over and gets the ball. She's one of the better players on her team. And she shows that same sort of fierce competitiveness on the track. So she is in the long jump, the 4x100. She didn't qualify in the 100 meter to get to the city finals. But our daughter, Maitland, city championships at Rob Ford Stadium. And, hopefully it'll happen next week. Hopefully not on a Thursday, so I'll miss.
Right. Your calendar's jammed up there. And of course, that's how all these things happen. I remember when we were kids, that was one of the things we really look forward to, is the sort of the regional track and field, and we all would go. And my mom would go to these events, and we used to, the local one was at St. Timothy's School on Shepherd Avenue at Don Mills, and that was where sort of all the North York kids would go and run. And they had a decent track. And on the east side of the track, it's a big hill, so you could sit up on the hill and watch everything that was going on. So I don't know how many kids there would have been involved in this track meet from our local school, but every kid would win some first, second, or third ribbon, right? And they'd put the ribbon, they pin it on there, and so of course inevitably the kids would be horsing around and the ribbons would fall off. So my mother says to them, "All right, well, give me that because you're going to lose it, right?" So she pins one on her. Well, then every kid that got a ribbon came and pinned it on my mom. So my mom looked like, Big Bird, because she had all these ribbons. And that every year then she would have to come because the kids look forward. So it's the event itself and the athleticism and the things you learn from sport are one thing. But those are the things. I have no idea how I did in the race, and I don't really remember. I just remember going and being with friends. But I'll have this vivid image of my mom covered in the ribbons, everything from first place to participant.
It's awesome how those things stick with us, because I love going to see Maitland, and I can do that more than I did with Miller when I was leader of the PC Party, right? So it's a blast that way. But I remember Dave and Keith, my dad being there watching me in a similar track meet. And I remember that made me go a little extra harder, believe it or not. And I think it was 1978, 79, somewhere around there. My arch rival, Chris Candela, had always beaten me in the sprint. And my dad was there watching me. And I remember in the last 20 meters, going by Chris Candela and winning the red ribbon to come first. I'm so excited. And it set a record. And then that record actually stayed until one day as an NPP. A kid came up to me with his dad and said, "Hey, this is my son. He just beat your record in the 100 meter sprint."
That's fantastic.
Right on.
So it was a fun memory.
That's
That was
great.
really cool. Took a picture.
That's
of
great
all
that you got to meet the kid that broke your record. That's
cool.
really cool. That's really cool. Good for you.
And that kid's name was Doug Ford. No, I saw.
Well, he did tell me he was a sprinter in high school, so I don't know. At some point there, I guess you take him at his word. So anyway, we're back on track. We've got a few snags here, and in terms of calendars and schedules, but
And I hear John's knocking at the door right now.
John is in the room, so we're going to
Right.
on in, and we'll add him to the conversation. And John, right
There you are. And just as a matter of interest, I went to St. Timothy's School.
There you go.
I attended it in grade 4, 5, and 6. So there you go.
Wow.
Small world.
I remember when the church was not built. It was interesting because part of the Toronto experience was that it was expanding so fast that the Catholic Church didn't have enough churches. So all of the churches that we went to between about grade 1 and grade 8 were all in school auditoriums. So we would have gone to George Henry just up the street and met there in the lunchroom until the church was actually built. And then we went over to Agincourt and we met in one of the schools over there until the church was built. So I actually didn't spend any time in churches for about 8 years. My parents taking us to school gymnasiums in 3 different places while they built the church. And it was very interesting. There was a whole era of church building priests. That's all they did. St. Monica's is not too far from here. I go in there about 20 years ago because I have to pick up something for a baptismal certificate. And there is Father O'Brien, who built St. Timothy's Church, and he's there to renovate St. Monica's. And I'm standing there talking to him and say, I remember you and Father Walsh, and you were doing all this. And he looks at me and he goes, where do you work nowadays? I said, well, I work at Angus Reid, Ipsos Reid. And he looks at the lighting system above and he goes, you know, we really could use some new lights in this church. Like never stops, right? Like never, ever stops. So anyways, that was a great, I was actually there. We got a day off at St. Timothy's School the day after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. I remember that very, very clearly. So
Okay, we're going to tell World Catholic school stories. I went to a Catholic school. I went to a couple that didn't have a church associated with them, including St. Bernadette's in Dundas. 4 rooms, 8 grades, so split grades each classroom. Because there was no church and it was across town, the priest came over, I think it was once a month, but it might have been once a week, and put a confessional at the back of the classroom in the grade 7, 8 room with a pretend slider up. And, all of us wanted to sit near the back rows. Not even in the cloakroom. We took confession in the classroom. That's weird, people. I'm telling you, that's weird.
If you sat far enough back, could you hear everybody?
Oh, I think the whole class could hear. Everybody got really quiet all of a sudden. It was
except
hilarious.
somebody sitting in the corner. Yeah, Keith, you didn't tell him about this other time.
Yeah.
And hence Keith Hudson's journalism career was born, taking notes and getting those things into school.
I heard some things.
We could do a whole program just on this, but I'll just leave you with it. I know we got to get to this, but I went. So Iroquois Public School is in Agincourt. It was the very first open concept public school in the country.
Wow.
And so I went there for 1 year, and what it was no walls. So it is a square building with 2 floors, and inside of the open area, only divided by filing cabinets, low-level filing cabinets, there were 6 classes ongoing at the same time in open space. And it was on both floors. Very first one was Henry Kelsey was the next one, which was also in Agincourt, but it was the first open concept school where there were no walls, only classes separated by low-level cabinets. So very, very interesting. I'm not sure much came of that, but we were the guinea pigs of that concept. So,
Well, and those were the days when we were building schools and school boards had some level of respect in the community, I guess. Just for a note for this, Kathleen Wynne is not among us today. Calendar challenges, so being what they are, so we're going to move on. But one of the things that popped into the inbox, and it might sound like a light thing at Queen's Park, but the idea that those who have served in cabinet before should be have the honorific of the honorable. So we'll just start now. We'll introduce Tim Hudak as the honorable. And
Can we still change my name down here?
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You deserve it.
Yeah,
You deserve it.
The Honorable Tim Hudak, and it would be the Honorable Kathleen Wynne. And it's one of those things, I think, for the most part, that most people really don't kind of appreciate Tim. But and I thought it was odd that it didn't apply to Ontario cabinet ministers, that our federal cabinet ministers, even when they leave office, still have that honorific. But premiers and cabinet ministers of the past here in Ontario do not. I might be putting you on the spot, but do you know the history behind that in terms of why that happened?
I really don't know. I have no clue. I always thought it was kind of peculiar, right? That it'd be different among the levels. I just assumed they passed a bill at some point in time, and it was never priority in Ontario.
Sounds like a Mike Harris thing. I have no idea, but it sounds like a Mike Harris thing.
Yeah, we got rid of the pension, we cut the pay, reduced the number of MPPs, and we cut off the honorable as the final straw of self-flagellation back in 1995. I always thought it was cool. I'm curious for your opinion and viewers and listeners if they care. But I thought it was cool how the Americans had that tradition. And even if you're a retired president or mayor or senator, you were still referred that way. And I just thought that was a sign of respect for the office and for public service. And, wonder why we didn't do it here, particularly at the provincial level. So I like it. I actually got a text from a couple of former colleagues who were reading the budget in the chamber and said, let me know that I can now be called the honorable. But yeah, this is my dilemma. Do I put it on my business card? Do I put it on my website? I think it's kind of neat. I'm curious what people think. Will it come across as being pretentious or kind of cool?
Well, it kind of goes back to the whole thing, John, and some people will remember this when we had, Queen's Counsel among lawyers. And, there was a whole lot of reasons why that became problematic. But, of those whom I knew who kind of had that moniker, they wore it as a badge of honor. So, it recognizes accomplishment in that area in public service. I think it's important.
Yeah, it doesn't have any. I think it's a great idea, and it is a great contribution when you have a member of parliament. I mean, we can criticize them any way you wish, but they give up so much family life. They make an impact for constituents, and I think they should be well looked after. And I think the title should stick with ministers of the crown. I mean, the only thing really, Tim, that a former member gets, and as all of us would know, is their name chiseled in some, granite or something, whatever rock it is, the green color at the front of the legislature. Their name is inscribed there, like the Stanley Cup. Other than that, I think it's a great idea.
Don't you still get to keep your chair, Tim? Do they still let you take your chair?
They charge you for that.
So I'm glad you asked that, Keith. So I just moved into a new office at Counsel Public Affairs, and I brought my legislative chair into my new office. After I left it had been wrapped in cellophane in the basement, and now it's been released.
Perfect.
So it's a neat thing that when you leave office, you're allowed to purchase your chair, and that goes back into buying new chairs. And so now I have two, because when I first was elected, you guys probably remember the chairs were actually blue, almost like a royal blue. Yeah. So I've got that one in my 80s rec room basement because it kind of fits the color scheme of the 80s. And then they brought in, I think, more appropriate green chairs. They're comfortable. They're really cool, but just that symbol, and it's still in good shape today, is meaningful to me. And people ask about the chair when they come to the office. So the chair now, Keith, is back in action as of Monday.
I'm glad to hear that. And I have no trouble with the honorific of honorable whatsoever. And Tim, put it on your business card, put it on the website. Absolutely. I mean, it was earned. Unlike Dave mentioned the Queen's Counsel, sometimes I think that was perceived as not earned, but more political favors type thing. But it's back. Premier Ford brought it back. Of course, it's King's Counsel now, but KC, the KC designation is back. And I thought, in one sense, that the honorable was sort of a recognition by Ford, who brought back KC first, that for members of his caucus who aren't lawyers, at least there'd be some recognition in the honorable. And I remember Ian Scott, when he was attorney general, honorable, and QC at the other end. And that was impressive when you looked at it, and it was earned. So I think the it was a strange thing to find it in the budget when there's so many other things on budget day that you're looking for. But it was a nice little, again, I think that's why they plant those things in the budget, because it's something that people can talk about and even perhaps find agreement on. I mean, I can't see anybody really being outraged over people who've, earned how many people have been appointed to a cabinet position, even at the provincial level in Ontario? Not a whole hell of a lot over the years. It's a specific accomplishment, and it deserves to be recognized. Absolutely.
And two things on that, Dave. So a friend of mine just retired from federal parliament. The cost of that chair is $2,000. So if you want to buy it, it's a couple of grand. And secondly, having stuck that in the budget with a majority government, I think it's safe to say that that's probably going to happen soon. And I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I laughed. I wondered, at some point whether or not somebody around the table made the mistake of using the honorific inappropriately, and somebody corrected them and said, "Well, why don't we just go ahead and do it?" So it seems to be, and I hazard to say low hanging fruit, but it's one of those things. Well, why don't we do it? So and again, the media gets all scrambled and turned around on this, Keith, from time to time in terms of, well, they'll introduce Kathleen Wynne as the Honourable Kathleen Wynne.
True.
She corrects them.
Yes.
Right. Points out that you really don't do that here.
Let's face it, this is a heck of a lot cheaper than reinstating a provincial pension for MPPs, which is something that really does need to be done. But I don't see any governments willing to line up and make that an issue they're willing to die on at this point. But this at least is a recognition to many members of those who make cabinet. It's an impressive accomplishment. But they do need a pension plan.
I was just going to say,
I just want to throw that back out on the table. And, a government that just increased its deficit for the year from $4 billion to $14 billion can't be thinking about a pension plan for MPPs at this point. But at some point, that issue will have to be addressed.
Well,
Tim?
I'll add on that, like the pay level, right? The pay has been frozen since 2008, I think. So, if you're an MPP without an additional job, like being, whip or a minister, is $116,000, I think, per year, which, is good pay, relative to what average families have to get by. But when you're trying as a leader who tried to attract people to run for the party, to make the sacrifices in terms of their time, the public spotlight that's on them and their families, it is a barrier. And then when I looked at what I would pay, sort of mid-level positions at AREA, we're earning more than an MPP or even a parliamentary assistant. That's not right. And I heard the Premier make some comments. He's going to have a look at that. They should do that across, all parties, or if they have outsiders decide. But it is time to take a look at compensation for politicians if you still want to attract, high quality people to the job.
Well, John, it's also a matter of, again, being in a place for 6-8 years, whatever it might be. And, out of that $116,000, then it's up to you to make sure you're putting some money aside for the purposes of your retirement. And I'm not saying that's unwise, but a lot of people don't do that. So I just think it's another obvious way that we should be recognizing the value of public service.
Yeah, to attract people is a really important point. I mean, for $116,000, I mean, Tim, you're right. It is better than the average family would be. But to live in some of these cities, and including Toronto, I mean, it just becomes a job worthy enough for young people who don't really care, that they have a big salary, and for the wealthy who really don't care because it's, a paltry amount. So I think it's important to have a good amount there. And for people, and also it to have to be done fairly early on in the term of a majority government. You'd want to make sure that you put it up in the first year so that by the time you got around to your fourth year or maybe more, it had kind of baked into the system. But I think there's a lot of room for increase in pay and pensions. We do know federally at least one individual who took their own life after having served federally. Because they were destitute afterwards, after they were defeated. I mean, there were other issues associated with that, but there are people who, if you're on the opposition side and you get out, you're not open to going to, oftentimes getting the invitation to go to a consulting firm or other things, right? Like, I mean, it's just like you've got to make.
The former MPP was homeless last year.
Yeah,
but that's the point. It shouldn't be this way. For a 20-something young person to to get elected. I mean, Phil Gillies, I guess back in the 80s, was the youngest individual to get elected. And I mean, it must have been an amazing amount of money at that time to come into. But nowadays, I mean, you couldn't afford to even rent an apartment anywhere in Toronto if you got elected. So I think it's time to even at this stage in the Ford government's regime to put it on the table and start working on it.
But inevitably, we get into the you people conversation, Tim, and I think we other our public service folks just because we disagree with them on whatever stripe they happen to wear politically, and I don't think that can enter into the conversation. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, you need to have the this is the right thing, right? The courage to actually grit your teeth, bring it forward. There should be a process to make sure it's fair and reasonable, and it should be set in a consistent way so you don't go through these, major ups and downs of waves of freezes and then significant increases. They tied to inflation. I think the federal government ties it to judges. Am I right about that? Which reflects, the average pay that civil servants get in terms of increases. But the bottom line here is what tends to happen is that one or two of the other parties will try to exploit that and say, how dare you give yourself a big fat raise when, cuts here, cuts there, that kind of stuff. So they really need to find a way for all of them to get together around the table, hopefully, and come up with a resolution that's going to retain and attract talent to reward the importance and dignity of the office, but also be seen as reasonable with a long-term solution aside.
That's why I think a pension plan is more likely saleable to the public, because most of the public assumes MPPs have a pension.
Yeah.
They just do.
Yeah.
So if you start trying to raise their salary and a pension, no, start with a pension plan saying, here's what our salary is. We do not have a pension. And then bringing, it was taken away and explain why politically it was attractive. But now the parties agree that they must need a pension, that they have to have a pension. Every other level of government has a pension plan. Why? It's something I think, because it would at the same time inform voters that you don't have a pension plan. It's a lot easier of a sale, even though it's going to cost money, and some opposition parties are going to say, well, it's going to be $100 million over time. Sure, it will, but it's going to attract people. A pension plan is needed to attract working people into politics. It's all there is to it. Giving up 6 to 8 years of your own pensionable time, for maybe a slightly better salary, but in many cases, a lesser salary. So let's get that pension. And as I say, I just think politically it's more palatable than just trying to give MPPs a raise.
All right. So we've managed to go through, the first 20 minutes here and generally agree on everything. So
all right, gloves are off.
Like we're gonna weigh in on a few other things, and we've kind of sort of chewed around the edges of this the last few weeks in terms of some of the subjects we've talked about. But it is constituency week, and I want to get your take on this, Tim, just in terms of the tone, the attitude, the expectations around constituency week, particularly on two levels. First, right after a budget, one. Two, Bill 5 is the thing that's sitting out there, and as many people have talked about, that's the elephant in the room. And it was presented on like Friday of what was it, Good Friday, or was the Friday before Easter or something like that. It was a Friday dump, and that's what the criticism of that the Ford government was getting, that they were kind of putting this huge omnibus bill out there to get Ontario back on its economic feet and everything else to the legislature. And Donald Trump and the tariffs were the primary driver behind that legislation. And for the most part, people were agreeing, we want to do all of this. We want to make sure we got the mines up, and we want to make sure we got our resources taken care of, and we want to make sure that we get infrastructure built and housing built and all of these sorts of things. But when the rubber hits the road and people start to really dig down on it, it's becoming problematic. And I would hazard to say it's become more problematic in this last week because the legislature isn't sitting. Now, maybe it's just my perception, but the media has had time to really dig in and look at what is in Bill 5 and talk to some of the stakeholders who are affected by this or have something to say on it. It sounds to me like the government, when it comes back from its break or constituency week, is going to be in a place where they're going to have more explaining to do on how to push this bill through. And we can get into some of the specifics, but I just curious on what you think in terms of the dynamic of that happening during constituency week, and now everybody from the Narwhal to the Globe and Mail is kind of piling on Bill 5.
Yeah, okay. So it's an interesting point. I haven't really thought about that. So you're suggesting that if they had, done it after constituency week, they could maintain some momentum and not have the other side, throw the message track sideways. That's interesting. I suspect that the goal was, because this is such a major component to the Protect Ontario plan, right? So coming out of the election, how do we make sure Ontario's economy is more independent and resilient in the face of tariffs? You need to make wholesale changes because it takes forever to get anything built in this province, including siting a new mine or a new highway or a subway. So I think the thinking was simple as that they wanted to get this out early, get a legislature. And I think it's actually a healthy process now for those who are opposed to the bill or those that support it to get into the public debate. This is a ambitious, wholesale change on how we approve projects. And at its core, it is the right thing. Dave, 15 years to approve a mine in the province of Ontario is outrageous. And imagine how much that drives up the cost when capital is so mobile across the world. Companies will just shrug and move on somewhere else. I am somebody who believes that Canada actually should lead the way with our resources, from mining to oil to gas to forestry, even water. And we've got the ways to do this that is probably much more environmentally friendly than those jurisdictions. So bold legislation is needed to speed that up. There's so many overlapping, duplicating processes to get a mine done with the municipal and the Indigenous side and this ministry and that ministry and the mining, and it all accumulates. The notion of one site, one project makes a lot of sense to me. However, to get to the point here, this is a major change. And I think it is healthy for our system, for Indigenous communities, for environmental groups, for everybody to wade in and say, does it go too far? And then come to the right conclusion that keeps standards high, but actually gets things built.
Yeah, it occurs to me that, Keith, the thing that was buried maybe in the conversation this week is that it was in committee. And I thought, oh, really? We're going to have a committee hearing on this. And now, we can debate as to whether or not it's just being sort of lip service in terms of how the committee is going to deal with this bill. But there will be, to Tim's point, opportunity for opposition to sit down and say this is a concern. Whether the stakeholders will be in those committee hearings, I don't know. You might. But the idea that there is some discussion going on is important. But I will also say that the loud voices of opposition to this are not necessarily opposition to the mine or whatever it might be. It's opposition to process. And we spent a lot of time talking about process the last few weeks. So, for example, the whole Ring of Fire issue, the government came out with a $3 billion funding program for scholarships and incentivizing Indigenous and First Nations communities to get on board with Ring of Fire, et cetera. And they're just shaking their head and saying, you're throwing money at us. That's not what we want here. We want to be part of the conversation. We want to be part of the extraction process. We want to be part of the royalties or whatever it might be. It seems to me that those things now are being said out loud, and the public is actually, back to your point, I didn't know that was the situation. At least there's an opportunity here for a robust conversation.
There is so much in Bill 5. It's just unbelievable, really, in one sense. But to your point, the committee actually held hearings yesterday on Thursday. And of course, pretty much everyone there, no, I shouldn't say of course, but pretty much every group that appeared before the committee was opposed to the changes because of the process. Essentially, it's going too far, too fast, especially with basically eliminating the Species at Risk Act. It's now going to be something up to cabinet to decide whether a species at risk can hold up a project or not. There's also the creation of the special economic zone. So it's going to allow the government to create areas where basically no provincial or municipal laws or rules will apply. They can set not just environmental laws, anything else. And that scares people, especially some of the First Nations. They're worried about their rights to be consulted and to be included in these projects. I think one area where it's really, really hitting, here's one that really surprised me. The Toronto Zoo was there yesterday saying habitats are going to be destroyed because of the changes of the elimination of the Species at Risk Act. If those habitats are destroyed, please help us fund a biodiversity bank where we can keep the DNA from these species, that we can sort of keep them alive when you're killing their habitats. But they said the most important thing to keep them alive would be those habitats in the first place. So I don't think anybody saw the Toronto Zoo coming out against Bill 5, but that's the reason they did, because it's Elimination of the Species at Risk Act. These special economic zones also have people very, very concerned. There's another issue. I don't know if they're using special economic zone or what they're doing, but this Dresden dump in southwestern Ontario has made Constituency Week really difficult for Steve Pinsonneau, and I hope I'm saying his name right. Pinsonneau. I've not met him. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm sorry. But he's the Conservative MPP for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, which is where this dump is in Dresden. The government promised there would be a full environmental assessment. Now that's not going to happen. And this is to increase the size of the Dresden dump by 30-fold. And it's something like 10 kilometers from downtown. This is something that is hugely opposed, and it's got this Conservative MPP, this PC MPP, speaking out against his government. He says he's complained directly to Premier Ford. Will he be allowed to keep his seat as an MPP, or will he be, as a Conservative, will he be kicked out of the caucus for doing this, for going against his government? But the reason the government is doing this is, again, it's being allowed in Bill 5. So much is being pushed through here that even one of their own members, as he said, he's only one vote out of 80 in his caucus. So he doesn't think the government's going to back down here. But I suspect it will, in the long run, cost the PCs that seat, even if it is 3.5 years from now before the next election.
John, the whole idea of this kind of legislation, and say what you will, I'm just not a fan of the omnibus bill approach, but I get in this case where there are issues where we've got competing concerns or processes in various ministries or departments, etc. So I can see where you want to kind of make things more efficient there. But here's what happens is generally people top line will say, well, yeah, let's get it done. Let's do these things. Let's get it done quicker and faster and so on. But to get down in the weeds, quite literally in some cases in this, to Keith's point, we're talking about the Species Conservation Act is going to replace the Endangered Species Act. And the definition of habitat is really defined to the den of whatever species it might be, not, where they have to travel to get to that den or where they have to go to get food and everything else. That kind of detail gets lost quick. The attention span of the general public on this stuff, and this is not being critical, we got other things on our plate, is really limited. The attention span generally of the media on this stuff is really limited. So, that point around endangered species is not an insignificant one, but it's out of everyone's peripheral vision, for example.
Yeah, and for full transparency, my wife actually works at the Toronto Zoo. So I'll leave it to Keith to have said all the important points on that specific topic. And actually, if there are others at Queen's Park listening to this, I actually watched the hearings yesterday, not knowing what Dolph DeYoung was going to say. I had no idea. And I thought the biobank was a really interesting thing to do anyways, regardless of what's in Bill 5. But let me put it to you this way, Dave. The more we talk about things in the abstract being Bill 5, the less anybody in the province pays any attention to it. So, I mean, there is opposition to this. The debate is limited to a couple of days of committee hearings. And in fact, there was a request at the committee hearing to spend an extra day of hearings up in the north, and that was shut down by the Conservative majority on the committee. It's interesting to me because I've done a lot of work on public opinion when it comes to waste management in this province, that there are all kinds of opposition groups that are going to come to the fore and to go against anything that is going to be a major change to the biodiversity of an area. And we can really say that this is the big footing of government headed in the direction of the north, but could be used in other places to try and get something done. And the reality is that the federal government, especially given the mandate letter that the Prime Minister has put out, aligns with what the province probably wants to do. So no doubt there are probably conversations that have happened at that level to try and streamline and go forward. Having said that, and there's a lot in this bill that you could pick apart, it comes down to me, and I'd be interested in what Tim has to say because of the era on which things got testy in the province. It comes down to what the Indigenous leaders said at the table. This really was a debate between the minister who said, make no mistake about it, you will be consulted with. And while I'm not going to speak, as he said, I'm not going to speak to what's in the treaty. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, who was also the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, who was sitting at the table. That was the major issue for me. It wasn't about some of the other process issues. It really was about whether or not, the Indigenous groups themselves can agree on some kind of path forward. We saw out west with the pipeline debate that happened, in the internecine debate that went on, with different factions within the Indigenous community. So that appeared to me to be important. There was a great statement made that said, you know what, if you want to fast track this, why haven't you fast tracked the cleanup of Indigenous areas? That's a fair point. But I think, what first came to mind was Oka. What also came to mind was Ipperwash. What also came to mind were some of the intransigence of some of the local groups to even try and find a way through it with their other associates. So I think at the heart of this, we can say, look, in order to put shovels in the ground, you need a steamroller, and it is a big footprint. And Bill 5 would apply to naming economic zones for almost anything, including the tunnel that the Premier wants to get done. Unless that other issue is solved, I don't know where it goes other than potential confrontation. So, you can put all the funds you want, $3 billion on the table. You can give, royalty rights. You can do all of that sort of stuff. But if they don't agree to that, then it becomes a constitutional issue and a real spark for potential confrontation.
Just one point, Dave, from the Committee on the First Nations. They said yesterday, this Bill 5 and the $3 billion they've been offered has united the 134 First Nations in Ontario against Bill 5.
Yeah. Well, and I've, by accident or design, I've been doing a lot of work in the last year with First Nations, Indigenous, the Inuit community in Nunavut, et cetera. And Tim, universally, what I'm hearing on a number of levels around this sort of topic generally, and the line has come up that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So and that's the feeling around a lot of this. It's not that we're against the project. It's that we want to be able to benefit from whatever the project may be. In this case, it's the mining, et cetera, in Northern Ontario. But if you don't deal with those properly or realistically, I don't know where the provincial government goes on Ring of Fire. The whole the environmental impact of upsetting muskeg is more dangerous than carbon emissions, just because it releases all the methane. Methane has something like 30 times the density of carbon and the effect on the environment than would otherwise have. I have not heard anybody yet say, and here's how we're going to mitigate that problem, because that's an issue for the First Nations there. If you upset the muskeg and the methane, it goes into the water and the water gets spoiled, and boy, we're back into a whole loop of crisis that we hadn't otherwise anticipated or dealt with.
So a lot there. I mean, I can tell you from two levels of experience. One as Ontario's mining minister at one point in time, and now at Counsel Public Affairs, where we have a number of Indigenous clients that we're working with on projects to make sure Indigenous communities benefit in terms of jobs and to share the resources and our true partners. And Dave, you just covered the success of Agnico Eagle, right, in Nunavut, and how they've worked very closely with the local community and who become champions. So the point would be that I'm not as fussed about this viewpoint that this is going to steamroller Indigenous communities. You just cannot get projects done constitutionally or even practically unless you have support of the local community in 2025. And I think the Ford government recognizes that, and all companies worth their salt will as well. They're also putting $3.1 billion on the table for economic opportunity for Indigenous communities, as support to make sure you get your share. I always believe too that right off the top there should be royalties going to the First Nation communities near a mine site or a forestry site right off the top, so they're true partners in any kind of deal. Look, I think the bottom line here though is, do you want mineral investment, especially critical minerals, to be made in China, or do you want to have them made here in Canada? and quite frankly, right here in Ontario. And our processes are so involved, so duplicative, that it takes forever to get a single thing built, 15 years. My understanding, and if it's wrong, I'm sure the government will adjust the bill or through the regulations. This maintains environmental standards. It just speeds up the process when it comes to approval and removes that kind of duplication that exists. I'm happy to come back on the waste management thing. I've got some thoughts about that, and MPP Pinsnow as well, Dave. I know I've talked for a bit here, but I think this is long overdue. You get the public input. These committee hearings are healthy, but we need to swing things back into balance. We went so far that nothing is getting done.
Just a plug, we're going to, for those of you who are wondering what we're talking about as far as the Nunavut is concerned, we're in the process of releasing a series called The Arctic Edge with our friends at Global Public Affairs and Story Studio Network. But we're working with the folks at Agnico Eagle on this project. And as Tim said, one of the things that has resonated with me is mining happens over there, John. It's one of those things that's way out of our personal experience. And talked to the executive director of the Arctic Economic Council for this project. And he said, yeah, you know what? People don't realize how long it takes to do mining. It might be 10 or 12 years once you get a permit to actually get drills in the ground and start extracting minerals. That's billions of dollars. So the degree to which we can speed up any of that, there's an economic benefit to that right away.
Well, there is. So notwithstanding everything on the Indigenous communities, and we'll have to see how all of that works out. Let's put that off the side of the table. It's just the whole process of getting, underway with something like this. I mean, let's not make no mistake that, if we came into this podcast this morning, thinking that the issue that the minister laid out yesterday, which was effectively saying, look, we have tariffs south of the border and we have the Chinese who may want to go after who are going to outflank us in terms of how they extract their minerals. Donald Trump threatened Europe again this morning with 50% tariffs because he said, the trade war has not settled down, and there are no negotiations that are meaningful to the United States on the trade issue. So, I mean, we're stuck with another 3 years south of the border where, on a whim, the president of the United States can wake up in the morning and say whatever he wants to say. And secondly, part of his agenda has been all about precious minerals, whether it be the Ukraine or whether it be in the Middle East. He's talked about these things and he wants a part of it because that is what nations are after, because of clearly what we have to make in order to be part of this century. I mean, cell phones have minerals in them, and we've got some of the things that would go with the semiconductors. Having said that, how long would it take to get a road done? How much money would it take to put in place? How long would it take once from the approval of a mine and then going through the legal process of challenges afterwards would it take to actually go forward? What these companies and everybody want is stability and predictability. And with someone south of the border who can upset the apple cart with a whim any moment, and secondly, with a situation fraught with potential legal issues over the next 10 years at least, this is something which companies and others are going to look at and say, my goodness, I don't know whether or not I want to commit to this. I will agree with Tim, because I in the sense that I think if you put to the public that this is a priority, it would depend on how you word the questions, clearly. But if you put, some of the facts on the table about both sides of this, I think you would get a majority saying it's about time that we move forward, and that it's not just bigfooting. The reality is that it's taking too long to get things done in this province when it comes to the Ring of Fire. We've heard about it for a decade or more, and that it's time to move forward on that file. But again, Dave, I think it's the practicality of actually moving forward that's going to be the obstacle. We can talk all we want about government having powers, but as I said, we've seen Ipperwash, we've seen Oka, we've seen other places. And while there are going to be reasonable people who are going to try and figure out what to do in it, there will be intransigence on it. And so the road ahead is going to be fraught with great difficulty, I suspect.
Well, Keith, two of the things that came up as we're working on this series out of Nunavut is the phrase that struck me is that mining is done at the speed of trust, one. And two other things that, to John's point, have come up is certainty and alignment. And those two things have to happen at the same time. And that kind of lends itself to this, happening at the speed of trust. So that's the challenge, but there is a roadmap here. There is a examples of how to do this out there.
Absolutely. There are a lot of mining companies that have very good relations right now existing with First Nations communities that they're in whose territory they're operating. It does absolutely work. And I think a lot of mining companies have learned a lot from their experiences and how to do it and how to go about this as inclusive a way and as speedily a way as you can do. I mean, there's only so much you can push on these things to, before people need, no, we need more time to study, as you say, tearing up the muskeg. What's that going to do? We need more time to figure that out. So as long as people feel that the process is working for them, I think there's concerns now that what the government is doing is going to perhaps make those relationships that exist on a pretty good plane right now, make them more difficult. So that's some of the concerns right now, because they do have strong relationships. As I say, mining companies aren't dumb. They want to operate. They know whose territory they're operating in, and they have to work with them. If we can do better about getting equity stakes, to Tim's point about, royalties right off the bat, right out the beginning, and, having those royalties perhaps dedicated to, getting hooked up to transmission lines for electricity and that sort of thing. There's so much that can be done that can help both sides, especially the First Nations communities who have some terrible, terrible times, with flying communities with no electricity, relying on diesel, that sort of thing. I wanted to as well go back, and Tim raised his point about the Dresden dump. He wanted to say a little more. I as well wanted to just point out that one of the reasons the Ford government or any government is looking to increase this dump by 30-fold is because, as Premier Ford points out, Ontario sends 40% of its garbage to the United States right now on trucks. Mm-hmm. And at any time, Donald Trump can just say, and perhaps rightly so, we don't want your stinking garbage. And then what are we going to do? So Ontario has to start taking care of its own garbage. And if I might suggest, I think there were some studies done on a place called Adams Mine a while ago. And I think it's still empty except for some rainwater in there. If they're looking for a dump site, they want to put it on trains up north. I'm being a little bit facetious. It's a huge problem to tackle. But I think Premier Ford is correct in looking at the fact that we can't keep sending our garbage to the United States.
Tim?
Yeah, we could be shut down in a couple of weeks, by the Americans if this occurs to them. And I know we've got a large following. I don't know if anybody in the Trump administration is watching. So everybody keep that between us. Look, 2 points I want to make on this. One is learn from mistakes, don't repeat them. And then secondly, the role of MPPs and how that's deteriorated. With respect to not repeating mistakes, but learning from them, the Greenbelt changes that Premier Ford originally brought in had the right purpose, in my view. I know others will argue to the contrary, but it was really to free up land that was not environmentally sensitive for homes that people could actually afford. But because it had such a sloppy process, it became a scandal and totally derailed their approach on housing in those early days. We need to have more sites in the province of Ontario for waste because we are vulnerable to closure of the border. But you need a process, Dave, around that. You can't just suddenly declare one site in Southwestern Ontario, we're going to blow everything up, and that's the solution only. Plus, practically, if you're thinking about you've got a swimming pool here where you need to fill, that's a small site. It's only a couple of drops of a thimble, so it doesn't really solve the problem. It's not worth the political price. Look at expanding other sites, put that into a process, and make sure you play by some clear and transparent rules. Otherwise, you get back in the mess you had around the Greenbelt. And on Steve Pinson, I've gotten to know him, real salt of the earth guy, was a municipal councilor, real man of the community. And he should have the ability to vote against legislation. He's come out and said the government is wrong. And we need to respect the role of individual MPPs. I really look at it as when I was a leader of the PC party, if people disagreed, they came to me, right? As long as you're transparent and saying, listen, Premier, I can't support this and here's why, you shouldn't be kicked out of caucus. And the more we have people standing up for their community, I think the healthier in all parties that's going to be for our democracy.
Before we go, I do want to get to this other process story that kind of slid under the radar, but it was a story about the rules of procedure in civil litigation. And I know, oh my God, everybody's eyes are rolling in the back of their heads. And let's watch the paint dry. But I thought it was an interesting piece. And full disclosure, I got an earful from my son on this, who is a litigation lawyer. And the government, the AG at Queen's Park, is pushing ahead with changes to the rules and the way the courts work, et cetera. But there are some fundamental changes to it in terms of things like discovery and sort of pretrial discovery. So, for example, if you want to find out what the other side is going to bring to court, you can actually, have a discovery session, an examination session, find out what's in there. It's not just documents, it's based on what they're telling you and so on. And to some degree, that has led to a significant number of court cases being settled before they even get to court. It's a big number. So that should be viewed as a positive. There are those in the government who are looking at that and saying, well, that slows things down. We want to speed things up. So we're going to eliminate that, take that out of the equation. And that means that everything happens at court. It means, Keith, you have to go to court. It means you have to take up court time, etc. But it also means that both sides, the legal teams, go into that court blind. They really don't know what to expect. And I'm sure you've heard the phrase, you don't ask a question in a courtroom that you don't already know the answer to. So, and that's where the discovery part, pre-trial, comes into it. I know it all sounds very dry and difficult, but it's going to change the way litigation is done. And in fact, it may drive up insurance costs, everything else, because back to the certainty issue, it's taken certainty out of some of the court proceedings.
Going to mean more trials. I mean, as you say, so many are settled at discovery when someone, when the testimony comes out, and, oh, geez, we can't go to court against that. Let's just settle this damn thing right now. So if it's going to be more trials, more things going to court, well, they're not going to get to court any quicker, are they? Because the courts are so backlogged because we don't have nearly enough judges and support staff for the courts. That's the key issue. So the government absolutely is making some changes here. There's something about there's some concern that's going to make it more expensive for people at the beginning of the process. I'm not clear on that myself. I'm not a lawyer. I have no intention of ever becoming one. But these changes appear to be not addressing the key issue, which is getting more justices of the peace. Now, I know the government appointed a bunch more justices of the peace and a few more judges this week, but we need a lot more, and we need the staff to support them to keep the courtrooms open. We're seeing trials tossed out because of the time delay. They're not getting to court within that mandated time. Serious rape, attempted murder. I mean, some serious charges are literally being tossed out simply because they're not getting to court on time. So I can't see how taking discovery out of the system is going to make that quicker. I mean, you're going to go to court quicker, but you're going to be less well informed when something could have been diverted from the court in the first place with a settlement. I'm sure the government's trying to make it quicker, but more money for more judges is what's going to really speed up the process of justice in Ontario. Yeah,
and to be clear, this is civil litigation that specifically these rules apply to, right? So, but and Tim, the other issue here is the litigation lawyers will tell you that in terms of putting resources into a much needed system, criminal law and family law take precedent over the civil litigation. So if there's going to be new judges, it's probably going to go to the family law and the criminal law first. Oh yeah, and then we'll get to it. So there's a whole bunch of worms in this can that and lawyers on both sides, like the prosecutors and the defense litigation lawyers, are saying, wait a minute, we're in a place where we need to kind of look at this. Do we want to make it more efficient? Sure. Can we make it more cost effective? Yes. But there are real problems here that we're not addressing. And again, it may well mean that people who are victims of negligence, et cetera, are not going to actually be able to get their due in court.
So I can't speak with a lot of experience in this area, although I was sued once by a panelist on the ledge. Not here, but it's all water under the bridge. It's all in the past. But we actually had another one at AREA as well, just in terms of policy position we took and somebody who objected to that. But it does take a long time, right? It does take a long time and cost, and that's not efficient. And it strikes me here that the Attorney General, Doug Downey, is being very thoughtful. Like this is not rushed. This is heavy process. I mean, he announced this back in January of 2024. What's the justice's name? Justice Morowitz, something like that, to do the overall review, and then a working group, right, to do further considerations on this. And I think they're being very cautious and thoughtful, recognizing the need for change. But no government that I can imagine whatever party is going to want to change the system so you get more court cases or you cause more delays. So I believe it's a genuine effort to try to, get things done faster, to reduce unnecessary things in the system that may be dated. And sure, you're going to have groups that are used to the old rules and object to them, but this is sort of hearts in the right place. And I'm confident by this consultation process, they'll move us in the right direction.
Yeah, except John, and one of the arguments I read, and this was a piece from one of the law firms, was suggesting that you're going to make such a significant change to the legal system in the justice system in Ontario that it's going to be the outlier in Canada. One. Two is you're going to have to actually re-educate the current lawyers who are doing litigation law in Ontario.
Yeah, it may well be the case. I have to admit that the what has preceded our discussion today is a 2-volume, very heavily indexed report that's been put out, for comment. And I didn't read all of it before coming here because it goes on for hundreds of pages. But the reality is that when we're talking about civil litigation, we're talking about things like contract disputes, personal injury claims, property disputes, employment litigation, class actions, a whole series of things that it seems to me, again, without having read this report, you got to have discovery on a lot of those things, right? Like you've got to be able to look at the other side before there's some kind of conclusion. I don't know how this is going to be, how the process can be fully streamlined when in fact it's a combative forum, right? Like legal is not kind of let's go and make an agreement. There are mediation efforts now, a lot more than there ever have been before, and maybe that's part of the route that the report deals with. But I think the other side of the coin is just the mere cost of this. If anyone has gone through civil litigation, whether it be family court or whether it be through a contract circumstance, I mean, the reality is that the cost is an enormous part of the burden for anybody wanting to enter this arena. So I don't know how it actually is addressed, but I think that these are really critical issues because people will argue that it limits their access to justice. And especially when it comes to limiting access to the discovery of documents, then it leads to, accusations that the system is not considering their case and the entire case within the judicial process in a fair way. So I don't know where this goes, but the reality is I think it's going to be heavily challenged as it moves forward by potential participants.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the process is still in the works. There's still, there's consultation going on. I think the final consultation is the middle of June, something to that effect. The various legal associations are asking for an extension on that, to actually have a more robust conversation. But to date, with the exception of a couple of quotes in some of the stories and sort of boilerplate comment on the website for the provincial government, I'm having a hard time finding any kind of, that's a good reason to do this, Tim. And in fact, a number of the legal associations are saying there's no real good historic legal data behind this that supports the reason to do that. So again, it's one of these process stories that are going to be out of peripheral vision for a lot of people. But when you get into a car accident and you need the lawyer up front, all of a sudden, to Keith's point, this would mean that you would have to put up a whole lot of that money up front to get it, to make sure that the court case goes forward, as opposed to waiting to see whether or not you win, waiting to see whether or not there's any kind of case to be settled, anything like that. I think we're going to victimize victims in some cases if we're not careful.
Then I don't think he proceeds, right? Like this is a smart AG, experienced in the system, and this really was also driven by just judges who said the current system is not working. We've been doing the same thing now for decades, and it's kind of gone off into some rabbit holes. Is where we can clear that stuff up so we get court decisions made faster. I appreciate. I don't know how many different groups of lawyers there are, by the way. There's like 5 or 6 different ones in the article, which I guess speaks to the legal profession. They all have small groups that'll fight with each other. But I just, when you look at this process, it looks like a thoughtful, careful process with the right kind of motivation, and we'll see where it ends up.
All right. Well, let's leave it there, shall we? And come on. Before we go, I got to at least say that the government is still spending like drunken liberals. $14 billion deficit. and a debt that's going to hit $500 billion in 2027. Just putting it out there.
Yeah, well, we don't have grandkids that are born yet. They're going to have to bear that weight.
Well, my final comment in all this, I want to go back to Bill 5 for one moment and simply say that I do think that this is one of the few times the federal government and the provincial government will be aligned, that they want to move forward in this area. And I think it'll be interesting to hear the speech from the throne delivered by the king next week and to hear what kind of priority all of this has. But I think this is one of the few times when Indigenous ministers, of which there are 2 federally and provincially, and the alignment of provinces on projects like this are going to be much more in step as we go forward. Whether that helps solve the problem, I don't know. But I got to tell you, from a Liberal government point of view, this is a very different prime minister who is moving forward, and we'll see what kind of shovels he decides to put in the ground as opposed to simply having a steamroller.
Yeah, my final tool, I hope John's right, and it's a good point about alignment between Carney and Ford. And let's not forget the premiers of Nova Scotia and British Columbia. So a Conservative and a New Democrat are moving forward with similar legislation to Bill 5. And yeah, I'd love to see on the spending. I'm concerned about that, a breakdown of what is ongoing base and what are top-ups, for the threat of tariffs, and see where we actually are at. But heavy load coming on the backs.
Well, I dare say that this might be the first podcast that we have done in 2 months that has not been dominated by a tariff discussion. I don't know.
It did get a mention. It did get a mention.
I know it got mentioned, but it wasn't. It was sort of on the side of the desk as an effect that it wasn't the overriding issue. I'm going to take that as a positive. So let's just take that into the weekend, and we'll see what happens next week with the thrown from the speech in Ottawa, and the MPPs are back in their chairs, their $2,000 chairs at Queen's Park. All good. Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, John Wright, thanks for being here this week, and we're hoping that we can arrange calendars for Kathleen Wynne to join us. The Honourable Kathleen Wynne, the Honourable Tim Hudak, as we move forward. That just got unanimous consent from the group here. All right.
Absolutely.
That'll do it for us. Enjoy your weekend. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.